Hi there, welcome everybody. Welcome to the monthly Science Education Department seminar. Here in the Science Education Department, we have researchers engaged in studying learning in science and mathematics. We also study the STEM pipeline. We use high technology like our micro-observatory telescopes in classrooms. And one of the latest projects is looking at the impact of professional development of teachers. So we have a program looking at about 100 professional development programs and trying to find out what teachers learn from those programs. But today we have our special guest. We have Susan Carey, who's Henry Morris and Elizabeth Morris Professor of Psychology in Harvard Psychology Department. She's a product of Cambridge. She went to Radcliffe College and got her BA, then a Fulbright Fellowship, and then her PhD in experimental psychology from Harvard. She worked with Jerome Bruner, who had, if people know the history of science education, had a lot to do with the development of a constructivist view of learning. And he was good pals with my mentor, Gerald Zacharias, in revision of science and mathematics in the 60s. She's taught at MIT, and we intersected for 1 year at MIT in 1973, and has been at the Harvard Psychology Department since 2001. She's worked with Elizabeth Spelke, who some of you might know has studied numeracy, or the understanding of number in young children. So that's very interesting work. She's got a lot of prizes and awards. I'm not going to go through them all, but she is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, and she got in there young enough so that she lowered the average age of the members. For me, she wrote two things in 1985, Conceptual Change in Childhood and Cognitive Science and Science Education, where she laid out some of the issues involving what we think of as misconceptions and alternative frameworks, but from a more systematic point of view than we like to think of it in terms of how you teach. The editor from that journal said that the paradox of science education is that its goal is to impart new schemata to replace the students' extant ideas which differ from the scientific theories being taught. The resolution of this paradox sets the stage for current research in science education. And indeed, Sue's work did set the stage for my work over the next 30 years. So what I'm hoping for today is that her presentation will carry me forward in a report for the next 30 years. So I'd like to welcome Sue Carey.
An overview of what this new work of mine is. I'm going to present a new project, but it is just to convince the field of what you're already convinced of, because I don't think that the fields of cognitive development or science education have taken these lessons fully on board yet. Okay, so the talk, I apologize for these slides. I recently gave a keynote address at a cognitive development society where I put, weeks' work into making really flashy slides, and then I somehow managed to lose it. So these are not flashy slides, but hopefully the argument will come through. So as a cognitive scientist, my research has always been about the following problem. We human beings are unique in the animal world, and because the human conceptual repertoire and the human stock of knowledge is completely, a moment's reflection, completely unique in the biological world. Only we can reason about orders of infinity or the causes and cures of global warming or pancreatic cancer. I mean, just an infinite number of propositions we can entertain, formulated in terms of abstract concepts that no other animal shares. So the question is, what makes that possible? And And what makes that possible is going to be answered on 3 time frames. We want an evolutionary story. What's the innate component to what makes our minds unique? We want to understand the cultural construction of knowledge. So I do work with animal psychologists, comparative cognition, to address the first thing. I do work with historians of science and anthropologists to ask the second. But most of my work is developmental. And then you want an ontogenetic story of how do you get from the initial state of a baby, which, like animals, doesn't contain most of those abstract concepts and certainly not the stock of knowledge, to us. Okay, these are very hard problems. They've been debated in the philosophical literature since the time of the Greeks, and they're not understood in the cognitive sciences. So that makes them exciting to work on, chip away at them. So this talk is going to try to convince you, first and foremost, that as far as understanding knowledge acquisition, the acquisition of both this conceptual repertoire and the huge stock of knowledge stated in terms of that conceptual repertoire, there's really 2 very different aspects of it, 2 very different processes involved that differ in many ways that I'm going to show you. And it's really important to keep them straight because they are so different and they're supported by very different learning mechanisms. And I'm going to call them, for the purposes of this talk, conceptual construction versus knowledge enrichment. And a wedge into this is, as we think about what makes knowledge acquisition possible, that's the hard problem for the cognitive sciences, we very quickly recognize that sometimes it's extraordinarily easy. So if I tell a 5-year-old, if I ask a 5-year-old, do you know where crickets' ears are? They say, on their head. And I say, no, actually, they're on their knees or on their legs. Okay. Somebody else can ask that child 9 months later, where are crickets' ears? And he'll say, on their legs. Okay. One trial, and it's there. It's stable. That phenomenon is called fast mapping, and I first demonstrated it for vocabulary acquisition. Similarly, if you show that a ladybug falls on a child's hand, and first he's scared, and you say, no, don't be scared. That's a ladybug. Ladybug is kind of a beetle. Okay? Same thing. 9 months from now, the child will know the word ladybug and have it mapped appropriately to this thing. So again, fast mapping. Okay, those are the extraordinary easy cases. The hard cases are concepts that are constructed over centuries of scientific or mathematical development or other aspects of abstract thought important to people, and are the target of math and science education, and are not mastered by all learners, right? They take years in ontogenesis to be mastered, and they're not, in spite of our best efforts as science educators, not mastered by all learners. So those are the hard cases. Okay, so the easy cases are always cases of knowledge enrichment, and I'll give you very soon what the criterion for knowledge enrichment is. And cases which involve conceptual construction or conceptual change are always hard, right? The easy and hard don't line up this way. Some knowledge enrichment is hard. But the easy cases like fast mapping, all the cases that support fast mapping are cases of knowledge enrichment. So what's the difference between knowledge enrichment and conceptual change? In cases of knowledge enrichment, all one is doing, it doesn't mean that it's important, it's incredibly important. Most of knowledge acquisition is of this sort, is you're just forming new beliefs stated over concepts you already have, right? So hence knowledge enrichment. Whereas in cases of conceptual change, you're building a new conceptual repertoire. You are actually creating new computational primitives in the language of thought. That's always hard. And knowledge enrichment that supports fast mapping is always easy. Now, I don't know, probably nobody here knows the history of this field, but this is Piaget and his longtime collaborator, Inhelder. He really is the father of studies of cognitive development. And there were two parts of his research program. He was interested in content acquisition. That's my project, understanding knowledge and the concepts that articulate knowledge. Content just means meaning. It's a term of art in philosophy. But he was also interested in sort of changes in very domain general cognitive resources over childhood that need to be drawn upon in the learning processes that yield content acquisition. Now, and he characterized that in terms of a stage theory. He said, here's what infants' cognitive resources are. Here's what preschoolers are. Here's what elementary school are. He thought there were 4 qualitative changes. American psychologists concentrated mostly on this, but his work concentrated on both of these, and he didn't confuse the projects. Okay, so in one very famous book, just as an example, The Child's Construction of Quantities, this is where he did his famous conservation experiments, popping of popcorn experiments, the whole variety of experiments. Young children, if you have 2 glasses of water that are identical and they're both filled to the same spot, will agree with you that there's the same amount to drink in those 2. You pour one of them into a different shaped glass. They insist now that the quantity has changed, and where the one is higher is more to drink than the other. So it's all those experiments that were in this book. And he then had 2 theoretical summaries of why 4-year-olds answered the way they do, 7-year-olds the way they do, 10-year-olds the way they do. The first one was in terms of the changes in an underlying framework theory of matter, right? It was a theory change. And the second one was why the 4-year-olds theory was the way it was because they were 4, and why the 7-year-olds theory was the way it was when they were 7, etc. Now, Piaget's stage theory doesn't work, right? There is no such level of explanation in this case. You get all you need out of the characterization of the theory change. However, that doesn't mean that his project of considering what the domain general resources are that are needed for theory changes isn't an important one. And the work, so I've worked on conceptual change my whole career as part of this project. What's new to it is my interest in understanding what the domain general resources are for both cases of conceptual construction and knowledge enrichment. What I'm going to show you here is that they're different, which is another piece of evidence that you really need to distinguish these 2 types of knowledge acquisition, and also give you a wedge in another source of constraint on what the learning mechanisms are. So that's where I'm going here. Okay. This is Piaget. This is, I think, the modern view. This is my view of what the structure of this project is. With respect to content learning, we want to understand both the mechanisms underlying conceptual construction and those that underlying knowledge enrichment. And with respect to the domain general resources, at least for conceptual construction, I think we should consider the executive functions. Okay, so what are the executive functions? Executive functions are domain general capacities that underlie the human capacity for flexibly deploying their cognitive resources in thought and action. They're subserved by the frontal lobes. They're the main thing that distinguishes us from other primates is our huge frontal cortex and the executive functions they support. And they come in three main, partly dissociable capacities. They're slightly different circuits in the frontal lobes. One is inhibition. So the classic famous marshmallow task where you say to a 5-year-old, you can have one marshmallow now, but if you wait for 5 minutes, you can have 2. Then you measure how long they wait. How long they wait predicts their SAT scores at, and the likelihood of being in jail when they're 40, right? That's a long story. That's just a correlation, and it doesn't mean on its face what it might seem, but it's a very reliable fact. Okay, so that's inhibition, but another kind of inhibition more relevant to this case are when you have to inhibit a prepotent response, when there's something interfering with bringing the right data to bear on something you're considering. You have to inhibit it in order to use the right information. So that's internal. It's not to do with motivation. That's like the Stroop task. Working memory, especially updating working memory, the capacity to hold something in working memory and operate on it, as in a thought experiment, for example. And then set shifting just means the capacity to find your way around in this huge database we have in our head and adjudicate between possible sources of information that might be relevant. Okay. So there's lots of simple tasks that have been devised that reflect these, and there's a lot of psychometric work. There's a lot of controversy in the field of executive function, but it's getting at something much more real than IQ did. Right? It's a big improvement. It's a big improvement on the psychometrics of domain general resources that are important to thinking and learning. Okay. It's really important to school learning. So EF measures are the best predictors of school readiness in the preschool years, where school readiness is measured by just asking teachers who's ready for elementary school. But when you measure executive function, if you measure executive functions, numeracy skills, and literacy skills at the beginning of the pre-K year, EF predicts even future arithmetic and mathematical development more than preschool numeracy skills do. Preschool numeracy skills are very important too, but EF predicts school success prospectively and concurrently all the way through the school years. And what I'm going to argue today is one reason for that is that the business of math and science education is conceptual construction and conceptual change, and the EFs are drawn really importantly on those on the processes that underlie them. Okay. So there's many kinds of conceptual construction, but the one I'm going to talk about here today is conceptual change. And what I mean by conceptual change is not just changing your beliefs or increasing your knowledge, but literally changes at the level of individual concepts that articulate the knowledge. So this is the Kuhnian notion of incommensurability, and it's late Kuhn, not early Kuhn. It allows that incommensurability is always only partial and local, but nonetheless it's a real phenomenon. So if it's changes at the level of individual concepts, we need to know, well, what do you mean? What kind of changes at the level of individual concepts are even possible? And there's three kinds. you can differentiate a concept. Now, if you differentiate the concept dog into the concept of German Shepherd, Chihuahua, etc., that's a differentiation, but it's not a conceptual change because the superordinate dog still functions in your conceptual system in the way it always did. The differentiations that matter are cases where the undifferentiated concept in the first theory is incoherent from the point of view of the last theory. It doesn't stay around as a superordinate that still plays a role in thought. So one of the history of science case studies I did concerned the work on thermal concepts when the thermometer was first invented, because Kuhn had said that before black, no one had ever distinguished heat from temperature. And I said, look, what does that mean? You know, one's an extensive variable, one's an intensive variable. How could you have a concept that conflated heat and temperature? They're interdefined. You know, what could that even mean? And he said, well, I know what it means for the claim that before Galileo, no one distinguished instantaneous from average velocity, from average velocity. But you have to, you know, but I know what it could mean, but I don't know what the evidence for it is. So he had me read the history of science that he'd read that supported that claim. And it just went back to Black, who said, before me, nobody ever distinguished heat from temperature. And then there was no analysis of what that meant in representational terms or what the evidence was for it. So I went back to him and I said, this isn't what I need. He said, well, you're going to have to do the case study yourself. And here's what you want to read. You have to read the work by the students of Galileo who wrote the first book. It's called Essays on the Thermometer and the Barometer, and it's about as interesting as it sounds. But the point is you're going to have to diagnose the concepts they're using. And this was a seminal experience in my intellectual development because I read this. I had a collaborator who could read it in Italian, but luckily it had been translated into English at the time. It was right at the time of the beginnings of the Royal Society, time of Boyle. And it had been translated by people who also didn't have the concepts of heat and temperature. So they translated degree of heat as degree of heat. So it was a literal translation. And we checked that. Okay, so I read it in English. I read it 300 times before I saw. You have to do a conceptual change in reverse to do this, right? Before I saw what their conceptual system was. And indeed, they had an undifferentiated concept that failed to distinguish heat from temperature. In spite of the fact is that no such concept plays any role in physics after Black. You know, Black is neutral with respect to the caloric theory or statistical mechanical theories of heat, but all of them from there on clearly distinguish heat from temperature. Okay, so that's the kind of differentiation that's relevant. Similarly, you can coalesce two concepts. In Aristotle's view, there was a distinction between natural motion, what happens when you drop something, and artificial motion, what happens when you throw something. And those two motions had totally different laws between them. They were different natural kinds. Furthermore, both of them were were special cases of the concept of change. His physics wanted to distinguish natural changes from artificial changes, totally different laws in doing so. And what Galileo did was to show, first of all, the notion of change that includes, let's do an artificial change, throwing a ball or cutting a flower in half, isn't a natural kind. There's no science of that. And with respect to motion, there's no distinction between natural. I mean, obviously there are some distinctions, but there's no basic physical distinction between them. So coalescence is in which the coalesced concept in T2 unites concepts that cross ontological boundaries. That's an example. And then also a kind of change on certain cognitive science views of concepts that count as a conceptual change is when the very core of the concept changes. So in the example I'm going to give you, preschoolers, the core of the concept animal is something like intentional agent. And with respect to the target that is going to be in this case study, which is a vitalist biology, the core of a concept of an animal is a living thing. So that's another example of a conceptual change. These conceptual change build new conceptual content. They result in the creation of new computational physics primitives that function in a theory that didn't exist before. Okay, knowledge enrichment is contrasted with this because it always involves learning facts in terms of concepts that are already represented, or acquiring new concepts by conceptual combination of those concepts that already existed, like the child can learn the concept breakfast food, or when superordinate concepts are already represented, like if you already have the concept kind of animal, it doesn't require a conceptual change to add a new exemplar of a kind of animal, namely a ladybug, right? Okay, and so, for example, in an experiment on fast mapping, Markson and Bloom introduced kids to a new artifact-looking thing, and they not only told them the name of it, but they told them a fact about it. My aunt gave this to me. Now, understanding this proposition involves no conceptual change. The child knows all the words in that proposition and knows what an ant is and what it is to give. And they both remembered the name and that fact 6 months later, right? So both of these are knowledge enrichment. So I'm just hammering on these differences to get you to today's case study. So what I want to do is explore the relationship between the domain general cognitive resources that support acquisition of knowledge about the living world and ask whether the ones that support conceptual change are different from the ones that support knowledge enrichment. Knowledge enrichment and conceptual change, of course, have been studied a lot separately, but rarely. I think the two studies I've done, and I'll quickly tell you about one I did about 20 years ago, and then I just dropped this issue, are the only two that have ever tried to put them side by side. Conceptual changes are supported by bootstrapping mechanisms. In scientific and mathematical development, you use math to model scientific phenomena, and obviously you use the observed phenomena to motivate that modeling activity. But if you look at cases of conceptual change in the history of science, if you guys don't know Nancy Nersessian's work on how do you know this work? Nancy Nersessian's work on how Maxwell created electromagnetic theory. It's a beautiful case study in which she analyzed the notebooks he took, that he wrote, that he kept his what he did all day in. That was a very natural thing, a regular thing for scientists to do in the history of science. And when he had taken on the project of trying to understand Faraday's phenomena. So Faraday had found all kinds of phenomena. We call them electromagnetic phenomena, but they didn't really Faraday didn't have all the concepts of electromagnetic theory. And Maxwell had made an abductive guess that the relevant mathematics was the Newtonian forces in a fluid medium, that it was some kind of field phenomena. That's just an abductive guess. And then he spent 3 years trying to model Faraday's phenomena in terms of that mathematics. And there's no doubt that that's what he was doing. Not only did he say he was doing it, but you see all kinds of blind alleys he went to. At the end, he has to change actually the mathematics. He didn't fully realize how important his changes were to the mathematics were. But of course, analogical mapping goes both ways. And he developed the concepts in electromagnetic theory that mapped onto the relevant concepts in those mathematics. And he published, whatever it is, the 3 or 4 equations of electromagnetic theory. I was once talking to a physicist who thought he just did it by abstraction from the data. No, that's not, these 3 years of exploring this mapping is absolutely essential to that process. And the way it works is you have a placeholder structure comes from someplace. In this case, the placeholder structure is the Newtonian forces in a fluid medium. And then you all kinds of modeling activities, limiting case analyses, analogies, thought experiments, are what you do to fill in that placeholder. And that's the mechanism. I've studied many, many cases of conceptual change, both historically and in childhood, always involves this kind of bootstrapping. That's really different from the mechanisms in knowledge enrichment, which are just hypothesis testing over the conceptual repertoire you have, associative learning, Bayesian hypothesis testing, and very domain-specific learning mechanisms tailored to a particular problem are involved in knowledge enrichment. Okay, that's what the field says, but none of this says anything about the domain general resources needed. So the case study in intuitive biology. This goes back to the first case study of conceptual change in childhood I ever did, which is my 1985 book. So let me tell you just briefly, theory 2 is a vitalist biology. It's not constructed by children until they're about 10, but it's the biology it's a framework theory. It allows lots of specific theories within it, but the basic outlines of the theory is this. We need certain vital substances from the outside world, which are a source of energy, and we use the substances themselves. So air, food, water. Those are taken into the body, and then the internal structure of the body works together. I mean, this is a very vague framework theory, works together to harness the energy or the substances that we've taken from the outside body. And this supports our capacity to move, our capacity to grow, our capacity for healing. Ultimately, this supports life. And it's when the functioning of those internal bodily processes breaks down for one reason or another, we die. Okay, so that's the framework theory of a vitalist biology. It's shared by professional biologists. Of course, professional biologists, they wouldn't deny those statements, but of course they have much more elaborated specific theories underlying it and aspects of biology like natural selection, which are orthogonal to it. But the reduction of biology to chemistry and physics doesn't overturn that theory. It just gives a deeper explanation for how it all works. But this is cross-culturally universal. Adults in all cultures that have been studied, of course you can't say all cultures because they haven't all been studied, share it. Okay, that's theory 2, and it's, as I said, it's not constructed until about age 10. What's theory 1? Well, the child needs to make sense of things like X is alive, right? If they don't have a vitalist biology, they don't have the structure in which alive is a theoretical term. So how are they going to make sense of it? Well, the way they make sense of it is they notice that animals and people are alive. So what is it about animals and people that make them alive? They haven't a clue. But they inherit it, as trying to make sense of it, the causally deepest features they know about animals and people, and that's that they're agents, intentional agents. So it's an enriched theory of agency, but it's enriched to try to make sense of the phenomena that will become biological phenomena. And so alive is undifferentiated, so they don't know what properties of living things make them alive. And it's something to do with being real, because you say that something in a picture isn't alive, or something in a television isn't alive. Something about existing. Ghosts don't exist. When you die, you don't exist anymore, right? So something about existing, and something surely about activity, right? And dead is undifferentiated from inanimate. Dead just means not alive. But a table can be not alive, and your grandmother can be not alive, and they don't know the difference between those two. And death is also positively construed as living on under altered circumstances, under the ground, for example. So my daughter at age 4 asked me, how do dead people go to the bathroom? And I said, what? And she said, well, maybe they have bathrooms under the ground. Now, she didn't understand. I didn't actually tell her the true full story, but she wouldn't have understood it if I had. Okay, so animals and plants are ontologically distinct in this first theory, because plants are not canonical active agents. And the core of the concept is causal agent, but it is enriched with trying to think about the phenomena that will constrain a theory of biology. So in T2, I'm just showing you the difference at the level of individual concepts. Okay. So I've already gone through that. So what's the evidence for this change? I said they don't get it till age 10. Well, the main evidence, and it's the same evidence in the history of science literature, are what you might call phenomena. A student of Galileo's said this sentence, huh? And once you recognize what that is, that's a key to going back and diagnosing their concepts. So here's an example. Oh dear, the whole thing didn't come through. Yeah. This is also my daughter at age 4. She said to me, that's funny. Statues are not alive, but we can still see them. Huh? I say, what's funny about that? And she says, whoops, sorry. She says, well, Grandpa's dead, and that's very sad, because we can never see him again. Okay, this is just showing me the lack of differentiation between dead and inanimate. And so I then try to explain. I say, my explanation was, well, tables and chairs are not the kinds of things that can ever be alive. So tables and chairs are not alive, but we can still see them. Statues are like tables and chairs. They're not alive, but they never were alive, so they can't die. I mean, this long thing. Whereas people and animals and plants, first they're alive, and then they die, and then they don't exist anymore, and that's very sad, because we can never see them again. So she listens to all this. She sits and processes for 20, 30 seconds, and then she says, isn't that funny? Tables and chairs are not alive, but we can still see them. I mean, this just went completely over her head. Why? She hasn't even started to construct a vitalist biology. Okay. So here's what Piaget did, and the reason that he caught the imagination of the field of developmental cognitive science, although cognitive science didn't exist then, is that he discovered 100 billion phenomena and studied them systematically. And in this case, he found the phenomenon of Piagetian animism, which is saying that the sun is alive, the moon is alive, etc., like that. But he also studied children's concepts of death and found things like Eliza's confusions. And other people since then also studied when children start to build the right kind of model of how the body works. And you take those 3 interviews together, and I'm not going to go through them in detail, but you do the same kind of content analysis you do if you're doing history of science. You try to make sense of how the kids are using the words to get into what their underlying concepts are. So the animism interview includes questions like, what does it mean to be alive? Can you name some things that are not alive? This is really important because a kid in T1 will say my grandmother. That's fine. That's a perfect use. But also ghosts or dinosaurs, which it's relevant, but not, they haven't distinguished ghosts and dinosaurs. Monsters. What they don't say is tables. And then you ask them for a whole bunch of things. Is X alive? And you ask them to explain it. So that's just getting at, do they distinguish alive from inanimate, and on what basis? Okay? The death interview has no content that overlaps that. What does it mean to die? What happens to a person when they die? What happens to a person's body when they die? Can you name some things that die? When someone is dead, do they need to eat, pee, sleep? What might cause them? Does every person die, etc.? And you code the answers to these questions with respect to what somebody who has T1 would say and what somebody who understands the vital biology would say. It's an empirical question whether you can do this reliably. The answer is yes, you absolutely can. And then the body parts interview is for several internal organs. What's it for? What happens if you don't have it? What happens to the food we eat? Do we need a brain to be able to eat? Why do we breathe air? What happens to the air we breathe? Et cetera. So this is just getting at the factual knowledge that's going to be the placeholder structure for creating a vitalist biology. Okay, so the vitalism battery are these 3 interviews. They have content which are conceptually related, but don't overlap with a word, they're about different aspects of it. And one marker of the fact that what you're getting here is a conceptual change is that these 3 really tightly cohere. What the child says on one of them, even though it's very different aspects of a vitalist biology, what the child says on one of them predicts what they say on the other. Okay. To study a conceptual change side by side with knowledge enrichment in the same content domain, we also invented the fun facts battery, which just were 10 questions like, where are cricket's ears? How many stomachs does a cow have? How big is the tongue of a blue whale? Do you know? It's the size of an elephant. Yeah, exactly. That's what kids say too. So these are fun, right? These are fun facts, and we expect these to be fast mapped. We're going to do a training intervention to move kids along in a vitalist biology. It will work if it moves them along, but this construction takes 6 years. Two 20-minute training interventions. It'll be news if it has effects and of the sort you're going to see. Okay. So there's been one other study that we did that tried to get at, can you dissociate theory changes from knowledge enrichment? And the way we did it was we studied a population of developmental disability called Williams syndrome. It's about 10 times less frequent than Down syndrome. But like Down syndrome, it's a well-recognized genetic abnormality, so the diagnosis of it is not in doubt. And it's a very different cognitive profile from Down syndrome or autism or other developmental things. So these people are very severely retarded. But their language is amazingly preserved. And their capacity for fast mapping new lexical items and new generic facts is also relatively preserved. So the question is, what about their theory construction, right? So that was what the reason we did this study. Just one example that gives you a sense of what they're like. The first one that I ever studied was a 21-year-old, and she could read. They can't all read. She could read. And I asked her what she was going to do with the $50 I was paying her for a half a day's testing, which was a lot of money at that time. This was 30 years ago. And she said she was going to buy the latest Anne Rice vampire novel, and she was going to take her father to a Saturday night Raw wrestling match. And I said, "Oh, you like vampire novels?" And she very excitedly said, yes, she'd read every vampire novel. She started listing them. And so the graduate student whose work this was said to her, "What's a vampire?" And she answered without a moment's reflection, this is a quote, "A vampire is a man who climbs into ladies' bedrooms in the middle of the night and sinks his teeth into their necks." Okay. You would never hear that sentence from an autistic person or a Down syndrome person. A complex sentence, completely right, very fluent. Then Susie said, "Why do vampires do that?" And she stopped dead in her tracks. She thought for what seemed to be a very long time. She said, "I've never thought about that." And then she said, "Vampires must have an inordinate fondness for necks." She had no idea what a vampire was, even though she had read 30 vampire books. She was reading them as romance novels, which of course is one reason to read them, but she didn't understand that they're in this impossible supernatural border between alive and dead. She didn't understand that they were making new vampires, or that they were getting blood, which is what they needed to keep themselves going, even though they weren't alive. I mean, all the things that make vampires interesting ontologically, she didn't have. Well, okay, why? So what we did was we gave them the vitalism battery, and we gave them also something that corresponds to the fun facts battery, but it wasn't as good as the fun facts battery. And we matched each Williams syndrome adult with a child who had the same receptive vocabulary, which is a measure of knowledge enrichment. And the kids who had the same receptive vocabulary as them were about 11 years old. And we also matched them with kids who had the same full-scale IQ as them, who were like 6 years old. And then we gave them these two batteries. And the finding was the Williams syndrome's adults performed on the factual knowledge the same as the older controls. And they were worse than the 6-year-olds on the vitalist battery. So this tells us that, why did this go away? Okay.
Oh, yeah, 2%. Power supply. What's your connector look like?
Here we go. Got it.
You only got 2% left in your battery, though.
Oh, that's the problem. Okay, well, let's plug it in.
Underneath here, so you won't trip on it. And put this under here.
What's this? Okay. The only point we wanted to make from this is just another attempt to try to get the field to take on board that conceptual change is really different from knowledge enrichment. So that's what this experiment showed. Conceptual change must be distinguished from knowledge enrichment. But we didn't ask at that point, why do Williams syndrome adults never construct a vitalist biology? What domain general resource is damaged in Williams syndrome, doesn't develop normally in Williams syndrome, that's important to conceptual construction or conceptual change? So they're retarded. Is it low EF? Is it low fluid IQ? What is it? Right? So that's one of the things this work is doing. It's generalizing the lessons from the Williams syndrome study. Okay. So what domain general resources predict 6-year-olds' progress towards a vitalist biology? That's the first foray we took into this. And we did 2 studies, 80 children each, where the outcome measures were just the vitalist battery. We didn't yet have the fun facts because we wanted to see, could we even answer this question? Is there anything systematic that predicts the progress kids have made in constructing a vitalist biology? And so the EF measures were inhibition. Oh, this isn't on. There. Now it is. It wasn't connected.
No, it's on.
It's on now, but it wasn't. So that's just a minute off. So we got to wait till it comes off. Oh, I can tell you what happened. You don't need these slides. It's just words. So the outcome measures were the vitalist battery. The predictor measures were measures of set shifting inhibition, working memory, also fluid IQ, and also our knowledge enrichment measures, receptive vocabulary and tests of factual knowledge. So you give this large battery to a group of kids, and first you see what you can combine into composite variables. And it turns out, and this is important, if a vitalist biology is a coherent theory, the three components of that battery, those 3 interviews, should be correlated, and they are. And that correlation should survive, controlling for measures of accumulated factual knowledge and knowledge enrichment abilities, if theory construction requires something more than just what's required for any kind of knowledge learning. And both of those facts hold. You have very high correlations, and they don't change when you control for receptive vocabulary or other measures of knowledge enrichment. So that's the outcome measure. And then the predictor measures, now this should be on. Okay. The predictor measures are the EF measures, fluid IQ. Good. Okay, good. The knowledge enrichment measures and fluid IQ. And the results, first of all, is that the animals, what I just told you, they are intercorrelated, and that correlations do survive partialing out those things. But the major result in both studies we did was that set shifting and inhibition and knowledge enrichment scores each predict the composite vitalism measures. This isn't surprising. Knowledge enrichment is essential to conceptual construction in lots of ways we can talk about. The question is it sufficient for it? So when you now partial those out, do any of the other measures still predict additional variance on the composite vitalism score? And the answer in both studies was set shifting and inhibition do. Working memory and fluid IQ do not. Right? So it's really executive function that seems to be that's important. And of course, Williams syndrome people are very impaired in executive function. So 2 interpretations here. One interpretation of this is that, and this is the one I'm going to argue for, those executive functions are drawn upon in the very construction of a vitalist biology. But the alternative is, no, they're drawn upon in the expression of it. That is, I'm asking you tasks, I'm asking you questions, you're having to search your knowledge base. There's a competing conceptual structure from understanding people as agents that you have to inhibit. And so the executive function is playing a role in your performance on the task. That's why it's correlated with it. So I'm going to show you that there's no doubt that executive functions are involved in the expression of biological knowledge or any knowledge. But that's not the same as that's its only role here. So I'm going to show you a study that shows, without a doubt, they're also involved in the construction of the knowledge. So, evidence in support of expression. Under speeded conditions, undergraduates and biologists provide animist responses. Right? The old theory never goes away. It has to be inhibited. Also, healthy elderly patients, that means people like me, if you give them the Vitalist battery, they show animist intrusions. They will tell you the sun is alive. I mean, that's astonishing, right? 60% of people who are certified by MGH as disease-free, these aren't early demented people, respond to the animism battery like a 6-year-old. Now, their vitalism is intact because they're perfectly normal on the death interviews and the body parts interviews. It's just that they can't inhibit and we show various ways I won't go into, that this is just mediated by the declines in executive function in elderly people. Okay, so how are you going to decide to show whether the executive functions are actually involved in the construction of the theory? Well, you have to do a training study, right? You have to implement a bootstrapping curriculum and see that it moves people towards, you're not going to, in 20 to 30 to 40 minute training sessions, you're not going to get a 6-year-old to be a 10-year-old, but we know what the early steps of this are. You can move them along it. And you want to see whether measures of executive function predict who benefits from that training, right? And you want to compare that with teaching them the fun facts. At the beginning, none of them know any of these fun facts. So you want to see, you also want to teach them the fun facts, and you want to see whether the same domain general resources predict improvement of both. So the participants were 6-year-olds, and it's a very simple study. There's a pre-training measurement, then there's training, there's post-training, and then there's the predictor variables. And the pre-training interviews were the biology battery and the fun facts, the vitalism battery I don't have time to tell you how the training session worked, how it implemented a bootstrapping curriculum, but maybe if you're interested, I can tell you afterwards. But the important thing here is that the function of the different body organs and how they support movement, growth, and health never even mentioned the words alive or dead. There was no content in the training that overlapped the animism interview or the death interview. There, of course, was tremendous content that overlapped the body parts interview. It was all about the body parts interview. So, first of all, if the training affected the answer to all 3 interviews equally, then that's already strong evidence that this is part of a theory construction, right? So that's important just from that point of view. But it's also, what we're going to then ask is who benefits from the training. Okay. All right. The executive function and knowledge enrichment measures were just the subset that were shown in those other studies to be involved. It's set shifting and inhibition. I won't tell you what those tasks are, trust me. And then as a measure of knowledge enrichment, it's just the standard receptive vocabulary, because the kinds of vocabulary that are tested on those tasks are fast mapped, right? They're knowledge enrichment things. Okay, so first thing is, did the training work? Well, what we've done here, because we're going to composite these, is normalize the pre-training to 0. So each child was just, their score on the pre-training was the number of standard deviations they were away from the average. But as a matter of fact, these are 6-year-olds. They're way down on the vitalism scale. I mean, they're just at the beginning of the vitalism scale. And then post-training, expressed in terms of standard deviations from the average at pre-training, shows that in all 3 of the vitalism batteries, the kids learned. Not at all interesting in the body case, but they only learned by half of standard deviation, even in the body case. And in the animism, but there's far transfer to the animism and death. And in fact, the animism, they learned as much as they did in the body parts interview. Here's fast mapping, right? The target of the training was almost an hour on the functioning of body parts. They heard each fact once during the training. They improved 10 times, it's specified by standard deviations, on the fun facts than they did from hearing it once, than they did from hearing almost over an hour of the input to a bootstrapping curricula on vitalism. So evidence that the individual battery tests are tapping into the same underlying constructs are the patterns of intercorrelations. Below the diagonal there, they're corrected for age and receptive vocabulary. Interestingly, these correlations were higher after training, not lower. But they only got training on one of them. That is an amazing result. And it again shows that this understanding this bodily structure gives the child a framework to start making sense of the concepts of life and death. Okay, now what predicts it? So those correlations justify putting the animism, death, and body parts into a single composite outcome variable. And the EF composites were the set shifting and inhibition ones. So the central question is, do children with stronger EFs benefit more from theory-relevant information than children with weaker EFs? And is the relation specific to conceptual change? So the prediction from the first one is that if you divide low EF kids from high EF kids, the high EF kids are going to benefit more from this training than the low EF kids. And here are the results. These are modeled data of kids at the beginning who are at the sort of 10th percentile on executive function. That's the blue lines. And kids who are at the 90th percentile of executive function. They're not that different at pre-training, but they're really different at post-training. Okay, that's exactly what you would expect if the EFs are drawn upon in the very construction process. Is that true for fun facts? Absolutely not, right? So there's huge change in fun facts, but EFs don't predict it either at the beginning, or they don't predict the rate of change, right? Okay. Well, what about the knowledge enrichment measures? How do they predict? Does having good receptive vocabulary predict who learns? Well, it predicts where they start, right? And that makes sense because these are measures of accumulated factual knowledge plus the capacity to acquire new factual knowledge. And of course, you need a whole lot of factual knowledge as input to any kind of theory building. However, it has no prediction whatsoever on the constructive processes that are involved in the conceptual changes diagnosed by the vitalism battery. Those slopes are about as parallel as they could be. Well, what about fun facts? Exactly the opposite, and that interaction is significant. So the receptive vocabulary is measuring an ability to acquire new facts, as well as it's a measure of how many new facts you've acquired. So this is a complete double dissociation here. You've got the EFs on one side, and you see it has an effect on the learning of the biology, and receptive vocabulary has an effect on the overall state of your theory, but it has an effect of only on the fun facts does it have an effect on learning. So conclusions. Children with stronger EFs benefit more from a theory-relevant information compared to children with weaker EFs. And conversely, stronger RV are better at learning new facts. Conclusions. I want to try and convince you here. Conceptual change dissociates from knowledge enrichment with respect to predictors of individual differences. And if you weren't already convinced that these are different natural kinds, I hope this adds to that, right? Believe me, it's not necessarily easy to get science educators and developmental cognitive scientists to really take on the fact that conceptual change is totally different from most garden variety. Most learning we do, most knowledge acquisition we do is knowledge enrichment, right? Knowledge enrichment processes are incredibly important. That underlies most of the learning we do, but not the learning that's hard that makes science and math education fail. Okay? And I won't go into this, but it's understandable why EFs are required for this kind of, the very EFs that are required for this kind of process. It's consistent with it. It wouldn't have motivated it. And obviously, there's much, if I can't find a way to build a better, to use these results to constrain how we understand the learning mechanisms, I won't do this work anymore. I mean, that's really what I'm interested in. And so far, I haven't come up with anything particularly deep. But I still like the polemic point that the work allows me to make yet again, same polemic point that the Williams syndrome work made, in an attempt to get at least developmental psychologists and science educators to take the general lesson I've been telling you on board. Thanks.
Grab the pizza and then we'll be open for questions. Okay.
Sounds good.
Sorry.